Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really important book called How Democracies Die. And it's got a pretty chilling message. The way democracies are threatened today, well, it's not what you think.
All right, so let's get right into it. When you think of a democracy falling, what comes to mind? Probably this, right? Tanks rolling through the streets, a full-on military coup. It's dramatic, it's obvious, but the authors of this book say, nope, that's the old way. The real danger now is much quieter. It's an erosion from the inside. It's when elected leaders themselves use the very system that put them in power to slowly, methodically, and legally dismantle it.
So, here's how we're going to break this down. We'll look at how it all starts, the playbook these leaders use, the unwritten rules that are supposed to keep things safe, and what happens when those rules just break.
All right, Section 1, Fateful Alliances and Gatekeepers. So, where does a disaster like this even begin? Well, the book argues it starts way before you might think. It begins with a failure by the very people who are supposed to be protecting the system.
And to explain this, the authors use this fantastic, simple fable. Picture a horse who represents, let's say, an established political party. It's got a rival, a deer, that it just can't beat. So what does it do? It looks for help from, well, an unlikely source.
The hunter agrees to help, but there's a catch. He says, sure, I'll help you get the deer, but you got to let me put this bit in your mouth and this saddle on your back. And this is where you see the cost, right? The horse is so focused on winning that it agrees to something that takes away its own freedom, thinking, hey, it's just for a little while.
And of course it works. The horse gets its revenge on the deer. But then it says to the hunter, okay, great, you can get off now. And the hunter just replies, not so fast. And boom, that's the trap. This is what the book calls a fateful alliance. It's when mainstream politicians think they can control an extremist for their own short-term gain, only to find out they're the ones who've been controlled.
So that horse, it represents the failure of what the book calls political gatekeepers. These are the established parties, the leaders. Their whole job is to keep extremists out of the mainstream, to basically say, look, you don't play by the rules of democracy, you don't get to play at all. They're supposed to be our first line of defense.
But that raises a huge question, right? How are we, or the gatekeepers, supposed to spot one of these potential autocrats before it's too late? Well, the good news is the book says there are clear warning signs. It gives us a kind of litmus test based on the work of political scientist Juan Linz to identify them.
And here they are, the 4 big red flags. You have to watch what people do, not just what they say. 1, do they reject the democratic rules of the game? 2, do they say their opponents aren't legitimate? Calling them criminals or enemies of the state. 3, do they tolerate or even encourage violence? And 4, are they willing to shut down their critics, especially the media? The book's warning is pretty clear. If a politician checks even one of these boxes, you should be worried.
Okay, next up, the autocrat's playbook. So, let's say the gatekeepers fail. The person with all the warning signs actually wins an election. Now what? Well, they don't just tear up the Constitution on day one. No, it's much more subtle. There's a playbook they follow.
And it's basically a 3-step process. First, you capture the referees. That means you pack the courts, law enforcement, the intelligence agencies with people who are loyal to you, not the system. Step 2, you sideline the other team's star players. You go after powerful opponents in business or the media. You can buy them off, you can intimidate them, you can even use the law against them. And finally, step 3, you rewrite the rules of the game itself. You change election laws, maybe even the Constitution, to make sure the playing field is permanently tilted in your favor.
And if you want to see this playbook in the real world, the book points to Hugo Chavez's Venezuela as a classic example. Look at the timeline. It's not one big dramatic move. It's a series of steps. In 2003, he stalled a referendum. In 2004, he packed the Supreme Court, that's capturing the referees. And by 2006, after he'd solidified his power, he started going after the other players, closing a major TV station. It's the playbook, step by step.
So this all begs a pretty big question. What's supposed to stop this from happening? If it's all legal, what keeps a democracy safe? And the answer, the authors say, isn't just in the laws or the Constitution. It's in the unwritten rules, the things they call the guardrails of democracy. And there are 2 big ones. First, mutual tolerance. This is the simple but crucial idea that your political opponents aren't your enemies. They're just opponents. They have a right to exist, to compete, to govern. And the second is institutional forbearance. This one's a bit more complicated. It's basically self-restraint. It's knowing that even though you could use your power to the absolute legal limit, like, say, blocking every single thing the other side does, you don't. Because you understand that the spirit of the law matters just as much as the letter of the law.
And this quote really nails why that second one, forbearance, is so important. Think of democracy as a game you want to keep playing forever, right? To make sure there's always another game tomorrow, you can't just try to obliterate the other team today. You have to pull your punches because you're trying to win the match, not destroy the sport. Which brings us to the final and maybe most troubling part of the book, politics without guardrails. What happens when those unwritten rules just fall apart? The authors point to one main culprit: extreme polarization.
And I mean, just look at this chart. It's pretty shocking. It asks people if they'd be unhappy if their kid married someone from the other political party. Back in 1960, only 5% of people cared. By 2010, it's 40%. That's the collapse of mutual tolerance in a single graph. Our political differences aren't just disagreements anymore. They've become tribal identities.
And when you start seeing the other side not as opponents, but as an existential threat to your way of life, well, all that talk about restraint and forbearance goes right out the window. Why would you hold back? The gloves come off. Politics becomes constitutional hardball. You use every trick in the book, every ounce of power you have, to vanquish your foes because you believe you have to. The book gives us a really tragic example of this. Chile in the early 1970s. This is exactly what happened. The government started using every legal loophole it could to get its way. And in response, the opposition used every parliamentary trick to paralyze the government. Both sides abandoned forbearance. They basically destroyed each other, the system ground to a halt, and what came next was a military coup. The game was over.
So, we're left with this final thought. As the saying goes, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. Now that you know the playbook, now that you know the warning signs, can you hear the rhymes? The book's ultimate message is that a democracy's death isn't a sudden event. It's a slow process. It's the quiet death of unwritten rules. It's the weaponizing of the very things meant to protect us. And knowing that, being able to recognize those patterns might just be the most important thing we can do to protect the institutions we can't afford to take for granted.